All right, I think we're good to go. Hi, everybody. Welcome. So great to see so many of you here. My name is Kareem Rostam. I'm the program coordinator for the Ottawa Music Industry Coalition. We are super glad to see so many people here. This is fantastic. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. It's a privilege that we often take for granted. And with these IMBs, we are trying to empower and educate as many music industry professionals as possible. And I'd just like to invite you all to take this knowledge that any knowledge that you get during this panel and share it with as many people as you can so that we can all grow together. The IMBs are a panel that we do roughly once or twice a month here at OMIC, and these do eventually make their way onto our YouTube channel.
Yeah.
So please have a look at our YouTube channel when you can.
Yeah. I've been there.
We could just ask.
Oh.
All right. And yeah, I don't know what else I should say. Oh, we do have our next IMB in the 28th of February. It's going to be a sort of like conversation in the round about parenting in the music industry. And if that is something that is of interest to you, I urge you to come and join us. We will be releasing the Eventbrite page for that shortly. With that, I'd like to pass it over to Kingsley to introduce herself and introduce the panelists.
Thank you. Before I introduce myself and the panelists, I want to thank OMIC and Edwards Creative Law for sparking this conversation, especially as the government fiscal year wraps and new deadlines are on the horizon. This panel does come at a really integral time for both the artists and cultural curators or connectors like myself. Our conversation today will cover 4 topics related to grant writing: best practices, rejection, asking for help, and budgeting. So I'll have each panelist introduce themselves. We'll start with your name, your role in the music industry, and what are 2 things you would advise against when grant writing. So I'll go first. My name is Kingsley. I'm going to be the moderator today. I freelance in artist and project development, and I do other music industry contract gigs and stuff like assistant artist management. I've worked for festivals and whatnot, and a whole lot of other behind the scenes stuff across North America. The 2 things I do advise against when writing a grant is 1, do not max out the word count unless you really, really have to. Always try to keep it clear and concise. And 2, don't assume the jury knows who you are and that they'll be Googling or stalking your Instagram. In most cases, they're only really required to review what you submit in your application and your support material. So make sure that all those important highlights of your career and your arts practice and whatnot is incorporated. So I'll have each of the panelists introduce themselves, starting with Rachel, and then you can pass it on.
Hello, my name is Rachel Weldon. Pronouns are she, her, they, them, and I'm the director of Debaser, a nonprofit organization based on Algonquin territory that supports essentially underrepresented musicians and artists of all different sorts through mainly event presentation, but also supporting artists at creation and production phases as well. So I founded and I direct an organization, so I have a lot of organizational grant writing, especially that's like more top of mind, but I also worked as a grant writer for a couple of years as a freelancer and worked in artist management before that. So I've written dozens, if not over 100 artist grants and dozens of organizational grants as well. To keep it brief on my 2 things to avoid, I'd say avoid undervaluing yourself and your collaborators and avoid relying on name dropping. Natalie.
Hello, my name is Natalie. You can call me Nat. Bernardin. I've been working for the last 3 years as a business owner here in Ottawa. So I do booking and a la carte management. So In the account management that I offer, I do a lot of grant writing for artists and for organizations as well. Previously, before I started my business in 2020, I worked in the nonprofit. So I've been working for over 25 years in nonprofit organizations here in Ontario and in Manitoba in Western Canada. So I have extensive knowledge of grant applications, because that's a huge part of being an executive director, is getting the money into the organization to have everything function and the projects see the light of day. So yeah, it's work that I thoroughly enjoy. This particular subject is something that I'm super passionate about, because I know that the people that I work with tend to not be as passionate about grant writing. So I know that they need resources, and it's something that I like, sort of, you know, capturing the story that needs to be told. And I think that that's one of the, not things to avoid, but I think that I would say that needs to you make sure that you do is tell your story in a very concise way. A lot of people that are revising grants don't necessarily get to the bottom of your dissertation. So if you're not catching their attention right off the bat with, you know, you can elaborate as you go down, but really make sure that you're capturing their attention, and you're capturing their attention, their hearts, and you're sort of getting to the nitty-gritty right off the hop, to make sure that your grant is impactful in what you're asking for. So I think that's my number one. So Jadea.
Hi there. My name is Jadea Kelly, and I'm Canadian, but I'm currently based in Los Angeles, and I do freelance grant writing under the business name Fairy Grant Mother. I come from the artist perspective. I am an artist. I'm a songwriter. So I began writing my own grants at the age of 16, 17, and then I thankfully had a grant officer come to one of my shows, gave me his card, and said, "You need to come in and talk to me about what's available to you. We are so lucky as Canadians that we have access to this money." And so I had a grant writer for a time, and then I started writing my own again, writing them for friends. Now I do that pretty much full time. But I guess my two main things for when you're writing grants is double check the deadline date and the time. Too many people have fallen into that, especially if you're starting out. Double check the time that it is due, because sometimes they will be kind to you and extend it, but sometimes they will just close the door. The second thing is contact your grant officer. They are there to help you. They are employees of the grant system, so reach out to them, get to know them, and they want to help you. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, and I appreciate this conversation, and Mike selecting all of us to speak, because we have this varying experience and whatnot. And I also want to say the fairy grandmother is brilliant. Like what? Damn it, I should have taken that. All right, so for the next 50 minutes, 50, not 15, sorry. The next 50 minutes, I'm going to ask a question in each category that I have listed off. So best practices, rejection, asking for help in budgeting. And then after the panelists each answer that question, I'll share a real life scenario, and each of the panelists will have to answer to the best of their ability and share a piece or advice or two. And then after that, we'll open the floor to the audience to ask some questions in the chat. So starting with best practices, we're going to get right into it right off the bat. What goes into a successful application? Please share any advice and how one can articulate their unique selling point. So I know you folks have kind of like mentioned a bit of that with your introductions, but if you kind of can elaborate on that. So we'll start with Nat.
Yeah, I can come back on what I was saying earlier. I think whether it's a juried application or it's an agent that's reading your application, like I said, I think it's really important. And we all did this when we were in high school and university. You know, when you start a dissertation, you want to make sure that you sort of have the gist of what you're going to say, and then you can elaborate. So I think that that's a really cool strategy to employ when grant writing, because often they're going to read 3 lines. If they're not catching on, or if they're not hooked after those first couple lines, you've lost their attention for the rest of the beautiful application that you've put on paper or in the system. So I think it's really important to sort of have a very brief summary and then you elaborate. That's a strategy I think that's key. More so for organizations, but I think it also applies to individual artist applications. I think it's important to know who you're applying to. So these organizations that are funding artists often have guidelines and keywords that they're looking for in your grant application. So I strongly recommend that you sort of, when you're reading the guidelines, it's a strategy that I do, but I'll highlight keywords that I'll see, and especially if they're coming up more than once, like keywords or key sort of values for the granting body. And I'll try and employ these words within the text that I'm writing, because I think it's important for them when they're receiving our application to understand the link that our application is making with their values or with their core guidelines. So those are 2 things I think that are really, as far as like best practices, that are really important. And obviously the deadlines, start your application ahead of time. Too many times artists apply, they start the application the day of, and then they realize the application process is super grueling and they're never going to get it done. And then they're pressing send 5 minutes before, before the time. And then the thing crashes, for example, and then they can't get a hold of anyone. And it's, so many times artists have called me in a panic trying to figure out, and these people are getting thousands of applications for some time, like they're not going to extend for your little application that came in last minute under the radar. You might fall on somebody that will be super understanding, but I'd say 9 times out of 10, you're just a number at that point. So to be mindful to start your application early to see what it entails, and then time your employment of the time management that you have accordingly.
Yes. And I found myself applying, not necessarily like last minute, but like, submitting last minute, and just knowing that like all the servers, like you're not the only one whose chances are going to be applying within the last like hour or 10 minutes or so. And these servers can really hold so much. So being mindful of that, even trying to apply maybe 2-3 days beforehand. And then if there's anything wrong with your application, chances are a grant officer will reach out to you and maybe point some stuff out for you to revise. And piggybacking off of what Nat said at the start about writing that summary and then adding that context and elaborating afterwards, I always say state the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Like the first, 5 to 10 sentences of like maybe the project summary or whatever it is, that question. So then it's easier for them to kind of follow the remainder of your grant. And that's something that they can refer to if they have any other questions really for the remaining part of your application. We'll pass the mic to Jada.
Yeah, so I will second everything that Nat and Kingsley said about language. You really have to treat your application like an essay with an introduction and a thesis, and treat your thesis like an elevator pitch, where you have 20 seconds to tell them what you want, when, why, and using language like it is vital now at this time in my career. Make it urgent. Show them that I have this amount of time to achieve this, just proving to them that you know exactly what you want, and showing them that you've thought out the next 2 years, that you have a plan in place. So language is really important, but also the second thing would be your support material. If you're a musician and you're applying to record a new album, you want to make sure that the recordings that you're submitting, that this room of jurors are going to listen to, you want to make sure that it's mixed to its highest quality, and that it really impacts them. So putting a bit of extra time into that will really help you win over everyone in the jury. But also keep in mind that it's going to be a new jury each time. So I really encourage everyone here to keep reapplying. There's been times when I've been denied by Factor, I've been denied by Canada Council and the OIC, but I keep applying and I eventually get them. So that's what I feel about that.
Thank you for that. Especially with like the support material to add on that is sometimes it'll say like depending on like where you're applying to, it'll say that they only require 1 to 2 pieces of support material, but then there's a bunch of options. Like it's like optional to add this, optional to add in like a letter of support or something. Always add that just in case for whatever reason they don't really rock with that first demo that you'd submitted. At least you have something else in backup. So anytime something says optional, fill it out, please. It's a little loophole there. And last but not least, Rachel, your best practices.
Yeah, totally do the optional stuff if you can. It definitely helps your application stand out. And like read the entire application before you start to see what they're letting you upload, so that if you do have the opportunity to upload letters of support, that you ask for those a week in advance before the deadline or something from whoever you're seeking them from. But yeah, I think that the support material and the things that you upload, that's the things that will, just because the jurors see something new for every application, that will help it stand out. No matter what it looks like, that will be the thing that they remember. So as much as you can, like if you have any graphic design basic skills or advanced skills, or even just have good photos or video links, like I think the more you can kind of make your application visually stand out. The content has to be there, but it definitely does help, I think, just for jurors to remember it, if nothing else, because sometimes they're reading like hundreds of applications and it's just hard to remember what people are talking about. But in terms of like the actual meat and potatoes and the writing of the grant and how you can articulate your unique selling point, I think, I usually, like when I was grant writing with clients, like I just like to have a conversation with them. And I think that can be a really helpful way to like externalize your work if you're really in it and like can't really think outside of it. And it maybe just seems so obvious what you're trying to do, but maybe when you talk with a friend or with someone who's written a grant before, or like a colleague, they can help you identify like some undercurrents of the work that really like could form like an artistic statement. And sometimes certain funders will really be looking for that, like, what is your work about and what are you trying to say? Whereas other funders might be looking more for what is your business strategy as an artist. But either way, you should be able to sort of articulate what your work is about and who it's for, who the community that you intend to listen to or look at or whatever. So I think in terms of just like, where do I begin and how do I try to like make this an interesting idea to someone else reading it? It might be helpful. I think for me, it would be helpful to like have a conversation about it and try to like draw out a few themes. Like maybe that's, loss, or like maybe it's very universal stuff, but you can talk about it within your own experience and the ways that, the ways that your lived experience has kind of shaped that approach. Anyway, I could go on and on, but that's one place to start.
That's so real. But like, it's such a vulnerable like process too, when it comes to like writing grants, or like, because you have strangers looking at it. Like you have juries, people that you'll probably like never meet and whatnot, because that's a conflict of interest if you do know them. So it is a very vulnerable process. But to add on to what Rachel was mentioning in terms of talking it out and making more of like a conversation, you can also just record like on your phone, just talking to yourself and having like a little audio recording there. And then you can kind of like disseminate it into like writing an application. Also, there are some funding organizations. I know the City of Ottawa does this, where you can actually submit an audio recording of the answers. So in terms of accessibility or just kind of something what you're comfortable with, that's also an option there. And another thing I do want to mention about support material, we had referenced support letters. And for folks who are kind of wondering like, hey, what are those or where can I get them? You can start by if you have collaborators. So if there's producers, if there's like a venue that you're going to be using. Also, say for past, so a character reference, maybe you performed for Debaser, sorry, or Blues Fest, or I don't know. You can write to them and ask them for a letter of support so they can kind of speak to kind of like your professionalism and how they would ultimately support you in that practice, whether they are involved with the project you're applying for, or they can just say that you have made like some of that impact in your own community. So starting there. I'm going to end with a scenario for best practices. So the scenario is, I'm an emerging artist who's never written a grant. I have 2 singles out. I don't have any press, and I have under 100 monthly Spotify listeners. I need some money for an upcoming album. Should I even bother applying to grants, or should I wait until I have more fans? Whoever wants to take that first.
I could start with that. I think that absolutely you could write to a grant if you'd like to write a grant. But I think, yeah, like it doesn't matter how many fans you have. That doesn't matter. Maybe to some funders it does sort of matter, but there's other funders. So there's like funders that are more interested in the commercial viability of your work, like Factor, Ontario Creates, others I'm not thinking of right now. And then there's funders that are more interested in like the artistic output and how it enhances Canadian artistic landscape. And so maybe if you don't have hundreds of millions of fans right now, what you're saying is still something that a funder would agree is culturally significant. And so if you think you can make a case for that because you are exploring your heritage through your work, or you are doing something really innovative in like a space where maybe like you're underrepresented, like historically speaking, then that is definitely something that you could consider applying for. It's just a matter of which funder you go for. Happy to talk more about that, but I'll leave it to somebody else.
I definitely would apply. I think timing is crucial in grant applications. I think you need to apply for the right grant at the right time. And for that particular scenario, I think, and I know more of the francophone penchant of Factor, so Musique Action, but Musique Action has a program for, they have a demo program, but they also have an EP or 4 single program. And then that would be the program before getting a full length album production grant. So that's, I think, where I would direct sort of that person to say, okay, let's apply for doing an EP, like turning those 2 songs into maybe 6 songs and putting something out there to get some traction and to grow their current followers to something more substantial, to eventually apply for an album. Sometimes you don't want to rush things. You want to sort of build momentum, slow and steady wins the race. That's my philosophy. But I would definitely, for that particular scenario, I would be putting in an application at Musique Action, and I would be putting in an application at OAC, because I think those 2 bodies would sort of get on board with that whole development aspect of an emerging artist that's, that's got a couple singles and that's getting some traction, sort of help grow it.
Could you tell us what you mean by OAC, just in case some folks?
Oh, sorry, the Ontario Arts Council.
Perfect. Thank you. And Jadea?
And yeah, I agree with everything Rachel and Nat said about that. Every granting office, if it's in your province, or if it's your city grant office, or if it's things like Factor or the Canada Council, there are grants available to different stages of your career. So if I was in my early 20s and I had a small following and maybe 1 single out, I would go for something like artist development through Factor, which is $2,000. It's a small grant, but it can go towards video production, marketing, touring, or making a demo. And so if you can get that, I think 1 or one or two times in your factor career. But once you get that and you develop your recording repertoire and your streaming presence, you can move on to something like the JSR, which is 10,000. And so, yeah, do not be scared of applying. They want to help. They want to help emerging artists.
And I think just to further that, I think that like that whole timing, that whole realizing that you don't have to wait to have sort of a project for an album to start applying for grants. I would suggest that I would strongly suggest that you start ahead of that, because that A, will get your feet wet with these funders, and B, it'll help show that, you know, that you've got this traction and that you're building up to a career.
And for the artist development, there is like artist development through Factor that you can apply for, but I also suggest like looking into like your local arts councils or like the city themselves. So the City of Ottawa, they have a bunch of deadlines. One just passed, but they actually encourage first time, like folks that have applied for the first time, and they don't want you applying with a manager or like a grant writer like myself. They want you to go forward, so you kind of get your feet wet, essentially. And you have that under your belt. Also, definitely recommend applying for, or like first registering a portal an account through the portal for Canada Arts Council or Canada Council for the Arts as well. It is federal funding, but I've had, and not to like, you know, poo on Factor or anything, but I've worked with like a significant amount of artists who've actually never secured a Factor grant, but they've secured thousands in funding from local and federal arts councils. So something to also consider there, especially if you have smaller numbers. Okay, so this was a great start to the panel. Now we're going to move on to rejection. And I'm not necessarily, I didn't propose this as a topic necessarily just to open up old wounds, or not wounds, Jesus Christ, wounds, or to re-traumatize anyone per se, but the four of us, we were invited on this panel because we're considered experts in this field. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe anyone can really be an expert in something without failing. And that happens in the grant world. No's, rejections, not getting the full amount that you've asked for. So this leads me to the next two questions. One, if you feel comfortable, how many times have you been rejected for funding? And two, what type of feedback did you receive? And what did you do differently next time? So we'll start with Rachel, maybe.
I'm just trying to look at my stats because I actually do like, have I have this like really wild spreadsheet. But I think like when I was grant writing, yeah, so my unsuccess rate was 40%, which is like it's not low, it's pretty high. And I was like a professional, so it's very, very likely that you'll not get, you know, almost half of the grants that you applied to. Sorry, what was the second part of that question? I was so focused on the data.
Sorry, what type of feedback did you receive from the unsuccessful application, and what did you do differently next time? So it's kind of like two.
I've received all sorts of feedback, I guess, for artists, but one of the things that stuck out to me recently, and this is like especially relevant for Canada Council grants and any grants where you're maybe in competition with artists who are not in the same discipline as you. So Canada Council's latest system is that as a music artist, you're not necessarily going to be only in a pool of candidates with other music artists. You might also be like considered alongside other performing arts artists, for example. When I've juried the Canada Council, it's been like that. And someone pointed out, which I thought was like really apt, was that sometimes they were like a visual arts person, and they said they sometimes saw applications where visual artists would be like mentioning maybe events or curators or other names that like they took for granted everybody would know, but the other like non-visual arts people in that jury didn't know, and so like whereas a visual arts only jury would recognize those references and probably like score it higher, because there was just like a lot of that type of content and not a lot of actual content about like the artist statement, it was an unsuccessful grant. And I just thought that was kind of interesting that like you don't know who's reading the application. They might not get your references. Even if you're like, this is a huge deal in my community that this artist is going to be like doing guest vocals on my track, the jury may not know. So maybe like contextualize that with like, and this person is very significant because they're a leader in the field and they have been recognizing these ways, and like, it's going to help me reach a whole new audience by working with them. Like, you really have to spell it out. So yeah, I think that's good feedback that I've gotten.
Brilliant. Next. Oh, sorry, I should tell you. Sorry, Nat, could you please go ahead?
Your number's not that high. I think mine's at 44 or 45% refusal rate. So I think it's a 50-50 chance. Most of the time you're like, there's no guarantee when you're doing a grant application, obviously. And I think there's a lot of factors in refusals. La concurrence, the number of people applying to that specific grant is a huge factor. And I think for the times that I have faced refusals, always go for feedback. That's the first thing I can't stress enough. Always go for feedback. I know it's super shitty to like, go knocking on the door and going like, I know I didn't get it. I want to know. I want you to destroy me and tell me what I didn't do right or what, but it's going to help you. It's going to help you better write your grant next time. It's going to help you better tweak your elevator pitch like we were talking, and really allow you to hone in on that muscle, which is grant writing. And I think that Rachel touched a little bit on that, but like, I think it's important when you're writing your application to properly understand who's adjudicating this application on the other end. Is it like, for example, I mentioned OAC, the Ontario Arts Council, but if it's an arts council, there are other artists looking at your application. So I would play up the artistic value of your application. That's important to these types of people. That's what they're looking for. If you don't speak to them in their language, you're going to lose them, and your application isn't going to score as high as it should or it could. If you're speaking to factor, musique action, those types of things, la commercialisation, I don't know the French word, but like, the marketing, the marketing value of your album or your project or your video. What, how much employment is it going to create? How many dollars are you going to make off of this production or this album? Like, how are you going to get it on market? How are you going to promote it on the market, etc.? These things are going to be important to those types of people. So if you're up playing the wrong thing for the wrong public at the other end, that's going to adjudicate your application, it's going to be an unsuccessful application 9 times out of 10 because of that reason, because you're just not speaking the right language to the right public. So inform yourself when you're writing an application, who or which types of people are going to be adjudicating. And Rachel said it, but sometimes I know at the OAC that's a thing, but there's juries that are adjudicating applications that are music, visual arts, classical music, all in the same jury. So you have a jury that could potentially be composed of like one person that specializes in classical music, one person that specializes in visual arts, and they're there trying to sort of bring their part of their knowledge to their colleagues around the table, but you're speaking to a majority of people that don't necessarily know your type of art or don't know your type of music or your genre. So be super mindful of that. Again, know who you're speaking to when you're writing the application. That is a huge factor in refusals.
I'm going to chime in there. Thank you for that. And adding, because you know how I'd asked you, well, what does OAC stand for? Because like to us, we know what it stands for, but maybe to the folks in the audience. So the same thing goes with the jury. And I use this example a lot. Say if you're a music artist and you're talking about marketing your music on DSPs and whatnot. Well, what is a DSP? A digital streaming platform, digital streaming provider. What is that? So Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, you know what I mean now. But if you are going to reference an acronym, like at first, when you first mention it, write it out in full. And then if you need to save for like the character, like the word count, then you can use that acronym going forward. And then Jada.
So in terms of being denied by grants, as an artist, I've been denied by every grant, but I always reapply, and I think it's important to grieve the process, light yourself a candle, take a bath, sob it out, because I think as artists, we put a lot of our time and energy and our future and our dreams into receiving that money. And when it doesn't come through, it's very disheartening. So just know that there are hundreds of people applying, and a lot of the times it just comes down to funding, where they don't have enough money, not necessarily that they didn't enjoy your music or they don't see your potential. But I'd say when I'm applying for my clients, it's the same as you guys. It's usually 50-50. You can never really tell who's going to receive funding, but the main thing is the feedback that I have received from different granting offices is that I'm not being, like when I was first starting out, I wasn't being realistic about my outline. I think you really have to give them the meat, even if it's if it's just a tentative year plan. Just give them your dream year, and give them information about what's going to specifically happen here, and here. Like, I'm going to release the first single on this date, and we're going to release an acoustic video with it. We're going to pitch to these playlists with this company in Nashville. Like, just do as much research as you can, even if you don't have those connections yet. Think about what's possible, just to show them that the money is going to a good place, and that you're really going to do your best to promote your work.
Thank you for that. And yes, emphasizing that context does matter, and then wanting to see that plan. And again, with like the support material, those letters and whatnot, getting letters or like folks that can sign on. Say, for example, if you are going to be working with a studio in Nashville and whatnot, getting a letter from them would also really help your application to see that they actually are committed. So I'm going to start with the scenario to end this section for rejection. I've been creating music for 4 years. I've toured independently across Ontario, and then the most popular song is frequently spun on local radio. I even have a bunch of Canadian press reviews for my latest album. I keep getting rejected for grants. What am I doing wrong? Jada wants to start.
Well, I think what might be helpful is to maybe at that point hire a grant writer. I had someone write grants for me for a really long time, and just having someone whose brain worked in that way really helped me, and it taught me the language. And maybe just having your friends give you constructive criticism on your demos. I think that could really help. If you're consistently not receiving funding, try different granting offices, because I feel like during the pandemic, it seemed like there was this huge avalanche of like pandemic funding. So artists that hadn't really received funding before suddenly were getting funding. And so I did notice a shift where I would maybe submit 10 grants and maybe 2 people will get it, but after the pandemic, it was like 8 out of the 10 were getting it because there was more money. So I have noticed that shift.
That's when I kind of got into grant writing just a bit before the pandemic, but for the most part. So when it came to the rejection and like the success rate, I've like within the last 3.5, 4 years, I've written about it's like 48 to 50 grants, and 32 of them have been awarded. So had I had done that maybe before the pandemic, I don't know with the numbers and whatnot. It also speaks to the stories that I am like helping tell and whatnot. But there is a lot of funding to revitalize the sector, and there are still funds that do exist. So definitely keep an eye out. Rachel, if you want to answer the scenario question. We are a bit over for time, so if we can keep it quick.
Yeah, I'd say probably like you should ask your funding officer if you can, because maybe you're doing nothing wrong. Maybe it was just like, could be that it's just a really competitive round and try again. So ask your funding officer and do try again. I don't know. Sometimes it can make you bang your head against the wall, but it's just like wrong place at the wrong time, wrong person listening.
Period. Okay, Nat.
Yeah, Jada said like a lot of these places, the juries are different every time. So keep applying. I would ask feedback from friends and funders on my applications and see if there's anything that's a fil conducteur, if there's anything that's sort of repetitive that I'm getting the same comments over and over, and then I would sort of tweak that one thing. Don't change everything in your approach, because then you're never gonna really know what worked and what didn't. But I would sort of, by process of elimination, try and figure out like if there's one thing that everyone sort of keeps mentioning, then I would rework my next application en fonction of what I sort of got as feedback, and see if I can open the door with that sort of tweak. We didn't talk about this, but I feel like I just want to mention it. For me, it's important. I always tell my clients, like, what's your plan B? If you don't get the funding, speaking of refusals, like, what's your plan B? Never, the funding shouldn't be your plan A. Like, I'm going to do an album if I get funding. Then don't do an album. You don't want it bad enough. You're not planning for it, in my opinion. I know it's super harsh what I'm saying, but I think it's really important for you to have a plan B. The funding should help you take your project to another level, or allow you to have more funds to be able to grow it more exponentially, et cetera, et cetera. So make sure you have a plan B. And yeah, I think you have to sort of grieve the process, especially as an artist, because they take it so personally. They get rejected, and it's like a personal rejection of their music, their proposition, so take the time you need to sort of, let that go, and then turn the page and attack the next one.
Should have had you up here moderating. Thank you for including that. Do you have any suggestions of where else to get funding? Because I know you can crowdsource, you can ask your friends and whatnot. Nat, if you want to add to that.
I think Jada had something.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I also wish I had said that too, because it's so important to show the jury that you have other sources of revenue. Even saying that you're going to do an Indiegogo fundraiser and offer pre-orders and perks to all your fans. Showing your own personal contribution that you're going to pool together from your cafe job, something, show them that you're poor.
Yes, bring on the waterworks. We'll touch on budgeting and whatnot in a sec, but I'm going to ask for the next section. The third section is asking for help. So grants, we know they can be very daunting, and especially like when you're starting out, it could feel like you're alone when you're not. You can ask your local music association, like Mike, for resources. You can ask a friend, fellow collaborator, or you can ask the program administrator or grant officer from the grant organization. So my next question for the panel is, what is something that you wish you had known when you started grants? And tell us if you've ever had writer's block and how you overcame that. We'll start with Nat.
Can you repeat? Sorry, I was just answering somebody in the chat.
Oh, yeah, no
can you just repeat the question again?
Yeah, of course. What's something you wish you had known when you started writing grants? And tell us if you've ever had a writer's block and how you overcame that.
Yeah, writer's block happens all the time. For the last 3 years at least, since I started my business, I've been writing grant applications more so for artists. So I think that the whole writer's block thing, I tend to approach it like, I think it's Rachel that was talking about, like sitting down with them and getting them to like externalize their story and asking. So I sort of do this like interview process with my client where I just get them to talk. It's almost like a therapy session, and they talk about everything and anything, and sometimes even stuff they don't think is unrelated, but it becomes that undercurrent story that Rachel was talking about that, you know, that I can sort of end up telling in their grant application. I think, well, everyone probably has a very different way of approaching it. I wait for the inspiration to come too. Like if I'm not feeling it, I'm not going to force grant rate because I just, it's not successful for me. So for me, sometimes it's at 2 o'clock in the morning and sometimes it's at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So when I'm feeling it and I feel like I'm in that zone where that storytelling zone that I really feel like it's, you know, I get on the computer and I start writing. So I function a lot by intuition. So I try and follow my gut feeling. If I'm feeling it, I do it when the inspiration comes. And the first part of the question was, sorry, Kingsley.
It's okay. Sorry, my questions are a bit excessive. What's something you wish you had known?
I would have known.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I wish I would have known how impactful on my work was the experience of being on a jury. So I've been writing grants since I was like in my 20s. When I was working for an organization as a secretary, I sort of asked the executive director if he would let me write grants because I was involved in different community organizations and I wanted to understand sort of how the back end worked. But it's later, like in the last 10, 12 years that I was asked to be on juries when I moved to Ontario. And that had a huge impact on my sort of approach and my knowledge of, oh, okay, that's what's happening when they receive our grant applications. And I think that everyone that is listening today, if you already haven't done a jury somewhere, apply to be added to lists to be on juries at the Ontario Arts Council, at the city, factor, whatever. Like, I think it's important. These people, it's very educational what they do when they have you sit on a jury, because it allows you to really have a better understanding of the process of what your colleagues around the table are looking at, what sort of is lighting them up. And yeah, I wish I would have known that earlier in the work that I do.
And then to add to that, if it's harder to like get on a jury per se for grant writing, you can also look into like performance juries as well for like festival applications. Ultimately, well, maybe they're not like as like complex and whatnot, but you still are looking at like you're reviewing applications that someone is putting forth or that you're putting forth, right? And it's just a different outcome opposed to maybe like $10,000 check or whatever. It's an opportunity to perform somewhere. So those are.
And sometimes these juries, they pay you to be on the jury too. So that like, not
Yep.
only is it an investment of your time and your personal education, but sometimes you'll even get paid for your time that you
Exactly. I do acknowledge we do have 10 minutes left. And I did want Jada and Rachel to chat as well. And then I had another question on budgeting. So Nat gave us a lot of gems for this section for asking for help. I'm wondering if Rachel and Jada, if you can add maybe some tips on budgeting. I know we can't give financial advice, but just some of your own best practices. And then we open the floor. And then Nat, you're welcome to like add in some stuff too. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
sorry. Budgeting tips, is that, let's jump in there.
Best practices for like your own applications and especially detailing budget notes.
I think a budget is sometimes the best way to start if you don't know what you're going to do, because sometimes even the budget template that a grant will give you will have guidance on where to, like, okay, artist fee, I need to put that in. Okay, I need to put in studio rental, equipment rental, right? Yeah, producer fees. So if you're like, where do I start? Sometimes I think if you list out the things and what it'll cost, it's just a good way to that's a good starting point, and then you can start the writing from there. And then in terms of the notes, that is really important. Like, you don't want to just put numbers down on the page without giving information on how you calculated that amount. So if you're putting in $10,000 worth of artist fees, like that might seem high unless you explain like, I'm going to spend a year working on this and I'm going to be applying to different grants and it's a rigorous project that I'm doing. So this is the artist fees that makes sense for this type of project. Same for producers or studios, just like detailing out like number of hours times rate per hour times number of days equals the number that's going in the budget. Really break it down. That's it for me, to keep it brief.
All I would add is make sure you're listing union equivalent fees. You need to list realistic fees and tell them, like Rachel said, break it down for them that if I'm going to bring this guitarist in, well, I'm going to pay him $250 a day times 10 days equals this, plus his per diem, which is $35 a day times 10 days. List every musician's name if you're a recording artist, and show what you project will be the recording period. Also, if you're applying for a tour, I've applied for tours before where I will attach actual quotes from car rental companies. Be like, we're going to rent from Enterprise Rent a Car for this amount of time, and this is how much it's going to cost. That just shows the jury that you've gone one step further to actually hunt down quotes from places, even hotels that you're potentially staying at. If you're going to do a guerrilla postering service across Toronto, contact grassroots marketing and ask them for a quote of how much everything's going to cost. That just shows the jury that you are prepared.
Still have a bit of time, so if Nat wants to add anything on budgeting. No? You're good?
No, I'm good. I love what Rachel said. Look at the template. It'll give you ideas and it'll guide you. That's what it's there for.
And triple check the eligibility, like what is eligible and what not. And also ask a grant officer, because that could really mess up your application. But then in the case that you are applying for more than one fund, like for different funding bodies, say if I'm applying to the City of Ottawa and then also Canada Council for the Arts, in your budget notes, you can say that this funding, if awarded from the City of Ottawa, is going here, and then all of the ineligible expenses from the City of Ottawa would be covered by the Canada Council for the Arts, sorry, if it's applicable. Rachel?
Could I add something? Sorry, I just have like a frequently asked question I want to share because it can be like a little hard to wrap your head around sometimes, but so often with like recording or like most project grants that artists are eligible for, you can't buy equipment, but there's so many artists who are like DIY, like do-it-yourself artists who are like, all I really need is a new laptop and then I can do all this, I can mix it and master it myself. I just need the tool, like, but I can't put that in the grant application. So what the heck? And I understand that's frustrating because like that's how a lot of artists work. But so you can't put that new laptop in, but you can put an artist fee for yourself in. And then you take that artist fee and you can buy yourself a laptop. Sometimes it's just like kind of rethinking
that
the way you have to do it. But yeah, don't put a whole new studio equipment in your budget. It probably won't get funded ever.
And always ask for more than what, like I feel that there's a fine balance between asking for what you need to just barely get what you want done and a little bit more, because chances of you getting 100% of what you're asking for are slim to none. So there's like, as a general rule, there's way more people asking for money than there is money available. So, you know, a lot of these places are gonna try and stretch the amount of money that they have to grant to as many artists or funding clients as they can sort of reach with their funding. So be mindful of that. If you're going to have to scale back your project. So that plan B that we were talking about earlier, yeah, like included, be open about, like if I don't get all the funding, the project's still going to go on, because that's a question that comes up a lot in jury is, if we don't fund this project, does it die or does it live? And if it dies, then it's a yes or no. If it lives, then maybe we can still fund it, but not fund it to what to what the person's asking for, so we can keep it in the pool of funding. I don't know if that made any sense, but
that made plenty of sense. Thank you. The chat is kind of dry with questions, but feel free to ask. We have a couple more minutes, or maybe we did such a great job that you have no questions. But okay, Michael B. His question, is it just for purchases going forward, or can you use it towards past purchases that were toward projects like home studio equipment?
depends.
Really depends. Chances are, and again, you'd want to check in with the grant officer who's ever running the grant program, that these are going to be expenses that start after the deadline of the grant. And it is
some grants you can backdate 6 months. Some grants it's from the date that you apply. Some are from the date that you get an answer. So be really careful at reading through the requirements for the grant.
Next question is, thank you, Jessica. Next question from Matt is, how do you determine your rates as a grant writer, commission versus flat rate?
Get up.
I was doing versus deals. So that's like you get, I mean, for depending on the artist, I would also just do commission deals for BIPOC artists when I was writing. But a versus deal is you get an hourly rate. So maybe it's $30 an hour. Maybe it takes you 10 hours, so you make $300, but then the commission would be maybe 15%. And so like you get at least $300, but if the commission ends up being 500, then you get topped up to 500.
I do the exact same thing.
I think every grant writer has a different platform. I know my grant writer that I had when I first started out would charge 15% of the grant, and that included her completing all the final reports. But yeah, everyone has a different writing platform. I will sometimes charge an upfront writing fee, but if they get the grant, I'll just deduct that from the eventual commission. And certain for things like factor, it's so much more work for the grant writer. It's such a headache, and you don't want to be doing it. So my rates are different for that.
For the next question, we're practically at 4, but if the panelists feel comfy staying on for another 5 minutes, yeah, I'm good. Kareem, I don't know, you're gonna kick us off?
No problem, no worries.
Cool. Next, Rachel, how to address ageism in granting, as in, is an emerging artist only a young one? Does anyone want to answer that?
Great question. I mean, it's kind of a systemic thing, tough for us to talk about today, I think, but Canada Council has recently like redefined it as early career. But yeah, I mean, ageism in grant, I think that is very much a thing. I don't know. Big can of worms.
I think again, it's in the storytelling that if you're 40 something and you're an emerging artist, I think it's, telling the story of how you got to where you are and why now, I don't think it's Jada that was saying like the why me, why now, why this, how does that fit into my timeline? But I do agree with Rachel. I think it's a bigger systemic problem that requires a whole lot of conversation. But I think that we're talking a lot more about inclusion and equality, and that's part of it.
Next question is from Latoya. Do we have to live in Ottawa to apply for the City of Ottawa grants? You have to be within 150 kilometers for Ottawa grants, and you have to be on the Ontario side. So that doesn't extend to Gatineau, which is like a 5-minute walk. So they do support like rural areas within the Ottawa area, valley, whatever that is, that just keeps growing. Alternatively, if you do live outside of the city, then there are maybe in your town or city, there is like an arts council, but then there might also be grants from the city themselves. So the city of Peterborough or whatnot. Then there's provincial grants, and then there's also federal grants, so Canada-wide. Nathan, what are the top 5 granting funding options and companies to keep in loop with for deadlines? Again, I'd go with the cities themselves. So if you're in the City of Ottawa, and it's also depending on like what it is that like you're looking for too. I'd say the Ontario Arts Council and Canada Arts Council. Do you folks have any? I'm biased, but
we don't talk a lot about this, but I think it's an under tapped into the radio station, your local radio station, by law with their CRTC license, they have to invest in local music or local, and quite often these things come in the form of sponsorship for, for a festival or whatnot, but some of these radio stations don't know what to do and where to put this money. So if you have a project or a festival, or even, I don't know, like, they could take, if it's a local, take a local artist under their wing and say, hey, we're gonna throw some money at you and help you with, the production of your album or whatnot to get some visibility. But if their CRTC license obligates them to put some money into Factor or Musique Action, depending if they're a Francophone or an Anglophone radio station, but they also have to invest in their local market. So be mindful of that if you have friends or, you want to buddy up to your local radio station to see how, if ever there's an opening, that's also, it's private money, but it's also something that's, that could be interesting to tap into.
I wish I knew that. Okay, 2023, I have some doors to knock on. Okay, what? All right, Darissa, hey girl. Question: if the timeline for your project starts before the awards are released, does that lessen your chance in being considered for the grants? Again, I think it depends, but no.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Shouldn't.
Sandy Hunter, are there private granting organizations we should be looking for? Rachel answered in the chat for that one. Not a lot of private funding opportunities are for artists from what Rachel has seen. But again, with radio, which is a mix of private, I guess, public funding as well, something to tap into. Thank you for all your encouraging words. All right, Yulin, if I'm pronouncing that right. Thank you. All right, Marvella's question. What's the maximum words for an application to be interesting enough without being boring?
Well,
5. No.
I find I always hit the word count. Usually, I don't do less than the word count just because I want to include so much information. But yeah, I don't know if I have that issue. I'm always wishing that there was more words available.
I think Nat had touched on this earlier, but adding kind of like that summary at like the beginning, like that thesis statement, that introduction, the who, what, where, when, why, how, and then adding that context later on. So say if it's like 1,000 words or whatnot. And when I give out, like when I do my grant workshops, I use like case studies, like real examples. And I'll use an example where it's like 1,000 word counts. And okay, we've answered that question in 200 words or less.
Less is more.
Yeah, less is more. But there is nothing wrong with giving that additional context that Jada was explaining to. So I guess it really depends on what the question is.
And some grant applications, I know that's the case for the OAC, the Ontario Arts Council, they'll ask essentially the same question 5 times, but it's just asked a little differently. So if you have a lot to say, so this is for my girl Jada, but if you have a lot to say, maybe you break it down, sort of, you have the summary, and then you do like tweak the summary for every question, but you sort of continue elaborating on the bigger application subject throughout the 5 questions that essentially are the same, just asked differently.
And one way to make sure your written answers aren't boring, I find the best thing to do is get emotional, not like crying emotional, but just be honest with them about what inspired this new artistic project. If you went through a divorce, tell them about what really impacted this journey to these songs, because you are an artist and you're creating something impactful that will help people, and own that. Tell the jury that you're like, I am a healer. This is what I was put on this earth to do, and this is why I need your help to create this healing album.
Yeah, writing your grants is not the moment to be vague, guys. It's the moment to be specific and have an impact.
Gonna take these 2 last questions and then we will shut it down. Okay. The first one from Simon. As a French artist who would be classified as an electronic music artist, how do I classify my music as being francophone when often there isn't any vocals? Is this done via titles, or is simply me being francophone enough for the grants for francophone?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think the whole electronic music and the francophone music scene is fairly new. Not new as in all of a sudden people are making electronic music and weren't before, but I think that francophones who are making electronic music are getting a little bit more vocal on the fact that they're francophone. So Simon, I think that's the most, or the biggest important factor in how you identify. If you're identifying to the francophone community and you want to have roots within that community and get involved within that music industry community, that's, I think, how you're going to get identified within that particular sector. Yeah, I think it shouldn't be a frein. It shouldn't close doors for you. It should open doors.
Perfect. And Lazy Long. A little more focusing on budgeting would be greatly appreciated. Best practices for application of funding, spread across marketing, production, artist fees, social media. For example, JSR and smaller grants.
Great question. I think so. The JSR is the Juried Sound Recording Program from Factor, and that's specifically goes towards the album record. So JSR is sort of an interesting program at Factor. You apply for an album recording grant. So I think the costs that go into the JSR budget, it's been a while, so if anyone's written one more recently, let me know. But they're supposed to just be for the recording of that album. But you do still talk at length in your application about the marketing plan. I don't think you really access marketing funding until you actually receive the recording grant. When you receive a recording grant from Factor, it unlocks like an additional $50,000 of funding that you can use towards touring, marketing, radio plugging, that type of thing. So when you are building a juried sound recording budget, I think you just put in your album recording grant for the first budget, even though you talk a lot about marketing and the marketing plan, and then the marketing applications come later. Other types of funders, you put the whole thing in one application at the beginning. Yeah.
And also for Factor, just keep in mind when you are creating your budget, with Factor, you do have to show an additional 25% investment from yourself. So put in, if the grant, if you're a general like rated artist in Factor, you have access to 10,000, but you need to show 25% on top of that. So that's one. Factor's a bit tricky. There's so many little things that you can't learn in one day.
Oh my gosh, more and more questions keep coming in.
And they're all really good questions.
They're really great.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think some of our speakers have shared their emails at the beginning, and if they do have the bandwidth to answer questions, maybe consider sending them an email if you have some other questions that have not been answered here. I'd like to thank Kingsley, Nat, Rachel, and Jada for an incredible conversation. This has been fantastic. If you missed anything at the beginning, we will be posting this recording along with the rest of our, within our playlist on YouTube. I will share the link again in the chat. I will upload this by tomorrow. I'd like to also mention that we are super grateful for our funders, the City of Ottawa and Ontario Creates, and the IMB is a partnership between the Ottawa Music Industry Coalition and Edwards Creative Law. Really grateful for everyone being here today. Before we leave off, is there any final words from our speakers? Like, is there anything that you'd like to promote? Anything going on in your lives that our listeners should be aware of?
Other than plugging in my artist shows that are coming up in Ottawa, Yellow is playing a show on Saturday in Canada on Richmond Road at the Maison de la Francophonie. And other than that, I'm doing a tour with Yao, who's an Ottawa-based Francophone artist, but a tour in Africa. So we're trying to open up the African market for Francophone artists outside of Quebec.
Fantastic.
I'm putting a link in the chat, but Debaser has a show tomorrow night with New York no wave legend Lydia Lunch Retrovirus at Club Saw with local improvisers. We do a lot of weird music stuff, and so we're up to that usual stuff at Club Saw tomorrow night. Ticket link in the bio. I mean, not in the bio, in the chat.
That's fantastic. I'll definitely be there for that.
I am based in Los Angeles, so I don't think anyone in this chat would be able to attend, but I run a Canadian songwriting showcase here in LA. So if you ever do visit LA, please reach out to me. I'm trying to create a Canadian community down here, and it's sponsored by the Canadian Consulate. So if you are a performer and you come to LA, please let me know. I'd love to book you for the showcase.
Super cool.
Yeah, I just added like a little 1-2 in the chat there. I'm ironically stepping away from full grant writing, but do offer consults and editing and all that fun stuff. I started a co-working session, both online and in person, for grant writing, because you don't have to do it alone. We can all lean on one another and hold ourselves accountable to deadlines and stuff. So you can check out the link tree in the chat. You're welcome to hit me up over email. I added that in the chat as well. And all of next week and then some, I'm heading to Brussels and Amsterdam to take part in this dope women's music thing. It has nothing to do with grants, but I am Factors funded and SOCAN funded, which is
Very
great.
cool.
I've never gotten a grant from either of them, but they're funding my ass now. Sorry, I that's exciting.
You have the best time, Kingsley. That's so
Have
good.
fun.
Thank you. But yeah.
Great talk. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch. And for everyone attending, thank you for attending. We will be back on February 28th with a discussion on parenting in the music industry. So if that's of interest, please join. Bye, everybody. Have a great night.